In its early stages, the Russia-Ukraine war was mostly a one-way battle, with Russia as the aggressor on top. It invaded, bombarded, and forcefully took territory away from the Ukraine, with the Ukrainian armed forces simply fighting to hold on to whatever bits of land they could, fending off one attack after another, struggling to find the team or freedom to launch any kind of counter. But things have changed. Now, thanks to some recent policy modifications by several NATO countries, Ukraine is hitting back more forcefully. Russia, meanwhile, is slipping into a chaotic state. It's running out of resources, its economy is crumbling, and even its president, Vladimir Putin, is feeling the effects, with his long-running image as an all-powerful leader beginning to show some serious cracks. Here's a closer look at how and why this is all happening, beginning with arguably the most important news to emerge from the war in recent times: the easing of NATO restrictions on Ukraine. NATO nations like the US, UK, France and Germany have all provided Ukraine with various weapons and equipment since the war began. The US, for example, supplied devastating HIMARS missile launch systems, while the UK delivered M270 missile systems, to name just a couple of examples. Ukraine also received some very impressive long-range missiles, like the ATACMS from the US, with a maximum range of close to 190 miles, or the Storm Shadow missiles provided by France and the UK, which can fire on targets more than 150 miles away. However, for a large part of the war so far, Ukraine wasn't allowed to use those kinds of weapons to full effect because of restrictions imposed by donor countries. To be more precise, several NATO countries told Ukraine not to strike Russian territory with their supplied weapons. So, despite having a whole stack of firepower, it had no authority to use it for any kind of attacks on Russian soil. There was a certain level of logic to the restrictions. Leaders of various Western nations, like the US and Germany, were worried that allowing Ukraine to fire on Russia with NATO-supplied weapons could lead to an escalation of the war, or even trigger Putin into declaring a much larger-scale conflict with NATO itself. For a long time, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky argued against those restrictions. He petitioned the leaders of various NATO nations to ease them and allow his country to launch counterstrikes on Russian soil. Some NATO leaders agreed with his stance, others were more reticent. But Zelensky's wish began to materialize in late 2024 and early 2025, as some NATO nations gradually eased restrictions, granting Ukraine the ability to strike military targets in Russia. Then, just a few days ago, on May 26, 2025, the new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, while speaking at a political event in Berlin, confirmed that all range restrictions had been lifted on weapons supplied to Ukraine. Merz stated, "There are no longer any range restrictions on weapons delivered to Ukraine, neither by the British, nor by the French, nor by us, nor by the Americans. This means that Ukraine can now defend itself, for example, by attacking military positions in Russia. With very few exceptions, it didn't do that until recently. It can now do that." Merz later posted on X to reiterate and reinforce his position, writing, "We will do everything in our power to continue supporting Ukraine." That's a huge piece of good news for Zelensky. It means that Ukraine now has the ability to launch destructive ballistic missiles towards targets on Russian soil, though these strikes are carried out selectively and under diplomatic pressure to avoid escalation. These targets might include military bases over the border, runways that the Russians use to launch jets and other aircraft, hangars where they store valuable pieces of equipment, factories where new drones and armaments are made, and so on. It's also a bad piece of news for Putin. Many experts feel that the Russian president has long been banking on NATO being too cautious to allow Ukraine to use missiles in Russia. He even issued warnings to intimidate Ukraine's Western allies. In September 2024, for example, he said that Russia would effectively be at war with NATO if it allowed Ukraine to use long-range weapons. This would in a significant way change the very nature of the conflict, Putin said. It would mean that NATO countries, the US, European countries, are at war with Russia. And for a long time, Putin's fear-mongering worked, and he got what he wanted. But the situation has dramatically shifted since then, and Ukraine has the ability to not merely defend itself and hold its ground, but to launch strikes and bombardments of its own. and it's already taken advantage of that ability, carrying out several strikes on Russian targets with plenty more missiles in stock and ready for future attacks. Russia finally has a real reason to be fearful. And that fear is on display in its latest actions. Recent days have seen some major aerial bombardments on Ukraine, with hundreds of drones and missiles launched on numerous sites across the Ukrainian territory, including the capital city of Kyiv. These attacks have been some of the biggest since the war began, with hundreds of drones and multiple missiles leading to several civilian deaths, injuries, and damaged or destroyed infrastructure. One attack was reported to involve 355 drones in total, the largest number seen in a single attack so far, as well as 9 Kh-101 cruise missiles from 2 95MS bomber planes, according to reports from the Ukrainian Air Force. These attacks have caused even more destruction and tragic losses of life for Ukraine. But there's a silver lining, and it's not an insignificant one. For one thing, all 9 of the Russian missiles were shot down before striking their targets. That proves just how effective Ukrainian air defenses have become. What's more, of the 355 drones, an impressive total of 230 were destroyed without dealing any damage or death. 55 more were disabled via electronic warfare, leaving only a small fraction of the full amount active and able to strike their targets. Each of the Shahed drones that Russia largely relies on for these attacks are said to cost around $35,000 each. So, to do the math, 230 drones taken out, plus 55 more disabled, make 285. 285 multiplied by $35,000 make $9.975 million, almost $10 million of Russian hardware wiped from the skies without dealing a single bit of damage to Ukraine. Russia is said to have spent over $145 billion on defense in 2024, with that figure set to rise in 2025. $10 million isn't exactly a gigantic sum when compared to $145 billion, but it's still a massive amount of money for Russia to lose in a single night, and a huge quantity of hardware that the country has spent time investing in and preparing to use, only to see it fall from the sky without any impact at all. And this kind of thing is happening quite often recently. Putin orders huge aerial bombardments into Ukraine, sending wave after wave of drones and missiles towards Kyiv and other targets, hoping to not just destroy the buildings and infrastructure of Ukraine, but also smash the people's spirit. But in the end, despite some damage and casualties, many of these grand-scale attacks fall flat, as Ukraine has the necessary defenses, like air defense systems and counter-missile strikes, to negate much of the damage. Time and time again, dozens, if not hundreds of Russian drones and missiles can be seen being wiped from the skies without hitting their targets. Each and every time that happens, it represents a loss for Russia and dents Putin's plans that little bit more. Many experts believe that the Russian president has ramped up the attacks in recent times in a bid to force Ukraine to the negotiating table and to put pressure on the US and other NATO nations to bring about a ceasefire deal with terms that are favorable to Russia. But that's not happening. Indeed, all attempts at ceasefire talks thus far have failed to get off the ground, as Ukraine is, understandably, unwilling to simply give Russia the win it wants. Instead, in spite of all of Putin's tricks and tactics, NATO nations are not backing down, but instead ramping up their own countermeasures. Countermeasures like Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal's Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025, otherwise known as Senate Bill 1241. This bill, which has only recently been introduced but is rapidly gaining traction and speeding its way through the United States Senate, could change the game entirely and perhaps even bring about an end to the war. Republican Graham and Democrat Blumenthal are co-promoting the bill and published a joint statement on May 21 outlining its purpose. Our legislation will isolate Russia, putting it on a trade island by imposing stiff tariffs on other countries that support these atrocities. One of the main priorities of our legislation is to hold China accountable for propping up Putin's war machine by buying cheap Russian oil from the shadow fleet. Without China's economic support, Putin's war machine would come to a grinding halt. While we yearn for peace, it's increasingly clear to us, and a supermajority of the Senate, that Putin is playing games. The United States Senate stands ready to act if these games continue. Graham and Blumenthal are certainly not pulling any punches with this bill. It involves a sweeping range of sanctions and duties against the Kremlin, including prohibitions on financial transactions with Russian entities. But perhaps more importantly, it also hones in any countries that might still wish to buy and use Russian energy. To be more precise, The bill states that any country which knowingly sells, supplies, transfers, or purchases oil, uranium, natural gas, petroleum products, or petrochemical products that originated in the Russian Federation will be hit with immense 500% tariffs. This is so important because even though many countries around the world have imposed major sanctions on Russia since the Ukraine invasion began, a number of them still buy, use, and depend on Russian fossil fuels. That includes nations of the European Union. In 2024, the EU spent around 23 billion euros on Russian energy, nearly matching the total military assistance it provided to Ukraine. Countries like France, Spain, and the Netherlands all serve as entry points on the EU for Russian-made liquefied natural gas, while other nations like Hungary, Greece, and Bulgaria receive Russian gas through pipelines flowing across the European landmass. Some European countries like Slovakia and the Czech Republic even have Russian-made nuclear reactors, which rely on Russian-made fuels to operate. All of those countries, 12 EU member states in total, could be subject to the 500% tariff penalty should they continue to buy and use Russian fuel. But it's China, not Europe, that is the main focus of this bill, as Blumenthal and Graham note in their statement. Since the Ukraine invasion started, China has increased its energy dependence on Russia. Looking back at 2018 to 2021, for example, Russia accounted for around 15.5% of China's crude oil imports. Since 2024, that percentage has risen to 21.5%. The Asian nation spends billions per month on Russian fuel, and it's not shown any signs in deviating from that policy. But with the looming threat of 500% tariffs, China might finally need to rethink its strategy. Add that fact onto the other measures included in the bill, which will have a crippling effect on Russian banks and oligarchs, and it becomes clear that this could be a veritable hammer blow to the Kremlin, the likes of which haven't been seen before. To make matters even worse for Putin, there's almost zero chance that this bill won't pass. 81 out of 100 US senators have already signed the bill as co-sponsors. That means they're fully committed to supporting this bill, and nothing seems to be standing in its way as it progresses through the Senate and onward. Of course, a few elements may still need ironing out and clarifying, and it remains to be seen how the bill would take effect, what goods and services would be included in the tariffs, and so on. Regardless, this is a big blow for Russia, without a doubt, and its ripples will be felt right now throughout the halls of the Kremlin and beyond. And the bad news doesn't end there for Putin. Another huge event in the Russia-Ukraine war came in the early hours of Monday, May 26, when the most powerful man on the planet, Donald Trump himself, made arguably his biggest statement on Putin so far. Writing on his social media platform Truth Social, Trump said, "I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He's gone absolutely crazy. He's needlessly killing a lot of people, and I'm not just talking about soldiers. Missiles and drones are being shot into cities in Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. I've always said that he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it, and maybe that's proving to be right. But if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia." This statement came after a long period in which Trump's position on Putin and the war in general had seemed somewhat unclear. The US president had made several contrasting statements, at one point blaming Ukraine for starting the war, also claiming that he was going to end it all almost immediately after taking office, and seeming at times to suggest that the US should bow out altogether and let Europe handle its problems alone. Many experts have speculated for some time that Trump had been trying to throw Putin a lifeline to help him broker a ceasefire deal that would work out reasonably well for Russia and put an end to this costly conflict once and for all. But it seems that Putin has rejected that plan, and that, as Trump states, he wants to push on and take not just parts of Ukraine, but perhaps the entire country. Now, regardless of what Trump has or hasn't said in the past, it seems clear that the US president is not going to allow Russia to continue. He will not make excuses for Putin's killing of civilians and mindless bombings of targets across Ukrainian territory, nor will he stop major sanctions and proposals like the aforementioned Senate bill from passing. In a nutshell, many experts now believe that Trump has abandoned Putin, and the effects of that can be seen in the markets. In the wake of Trump's statement, plus the announcement from the German Chancellor that Ukraine is now allowed to fire missiles into Russia, the Moscow Stock Exchange fell by more than 2%. That's one of the biggest drops the exchange has seen in quite some time, and the effects on some of the biggest Russian brands were even bigger. Companies like the state-run Gazprom and tech firm VK Group each lost close to 4% of their value, with Russia's national airline Aeroflot also dropping by 2.2%. The volatility index for Russia also shot upwards, representing a clear sign of panic among investors. And in terms of actual cash value, the Russian markets lost around 100 billion rubles total, which is equivalent to around $1.1 billion. And all of that came from just a single statement that President Trump posted online. Now, imagine how big of an impact the markets and the Russian economy at large would suffer if and when Senate Bill 1241 passes and 500% tariffs start hitting any and all countries that buy and use Russian oil and gas. That includes China and India, which together make up more than 80% of all purchases of Russian oil. Oil and gas are pillars of the Russian economy. In 2024, sales of those two resources accounted for approximately 30% of all Russia's federal revenue. By striking these key resources, the US and its allies can dramatically weaken Russia's position, forcing its hand and essentially dragging Putin to the negotiating table, whether he wants to be there or not. To make matters worse for Russia, the country's economy is already in a perilous position. A leading Swedish economist, Anders Aslund, recently stated that Russia is on track to exhaust its national wealth fund by fall of this year. He stated, "The most critical shortage, however, is budget financing, as Russia's last liquid reserves are likely to run out in the fall of 2025. Budget cuts will then become necessary. In the meantime, the war economy might also require price controls and rationing, the old Soviet sins. As the risk of a financial crash rises, Russia's imperiled economy is about to pose serious constraints on Putin's war." There are numerous factors playing a part in this, including a shortage of workers, the massive increases in defense spending over recent years, high levels of inflation, sanctions from many nations around the world, and so on. Because of this, the country's liquid reserves have dramatically diminished, going from $117 billion in 2021 to only $31 billion by late 2024. So while Putin may brag and boast about the strength of the Russian economy and how well it's apparently withstood Western sanctions, the cold hard numbers tell a very different story. Russia's economy is under significant strain, its companies are losing more and more money by the day, and even its expensively assembled armed forces are facing a brick wall in Ukraine, battling day in and day out, sacrificing lives, money, equipment and resources for only the most marginal of gains. Add on the fact that Russia has seen record losses of life over the course of the war so far, with at least 106,000 confirmed kills, and some estimates suggesting more than twice that amount, plus the fact that morale is on the decline, and Russia has seen major losses in terms of tanks, armoured vehicles, drones and more, and the grim reality for Putin is that this war is one he cannot feasibly win with ease. He's increasingly isolated, with a bleaker and bleaker picture to wake up to each day as former allies turn against him, long-term backers grow restless, and his many offensive manoeuvres repeatedly fall flat. For years, he's relied on fear to get what he wants, but as these recent events show, the world isn't afraid of Russia as it once was, and the cracks in Putin's once solid image are clearer than ever. But what are your thoughts? How do you see the big Senate bill impacting the war? And could it take the world one step closer to a peaceful resolution at long last? Share your impressions in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date news and information about Russia's war on Ukraine, the Middle East, and other major conflicts around the world.